Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation with a very courageous man who lives in Guatemala, has now for 5 decades, an American, however, a businessman who has brought to the topic we're discussing both a clarity about the nature of what's afoot and insights into what it means for us, not just for the people of the country most immediately affected, and that would be Guatemala. And Steve, we've advertised this conversation as part of a bigger story for sure. And what you've painted is a picture with both radical leftists who are in political office, President Barack Obama, President Joe Biden, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. We haven't mentioned him, but Secretary of State Tony Blinken, as well as people who are part of the sort of foreign service bureaucracy, notably a former ambassador by the name of Todd Robinson, now serving as an assistant secretary of state, and a kind of State Department bureaucracy that has been beavering away for some 10 years at trying to subvert the elected governments of Guatemala and institute a kind of, well, Marxist regime there, it seems, fulfilling the ambitions of Fidel Castro and his cadre. This is outrageous, it seems to me, contrary to our national interests, and yet something that obviously is moving forward unchecked. Is this an isolated incident in your experience, from what you've been studying our government, albeit from afar for a while, or would you say this is really something that has similar kinds of manifestations in other aspects of our government beyond the State Department, certainly beyond Guatemala, to the detriment of the kind of representative, accountable government that our Constitution supposedly guarantees?
Well, I think yes and yes to that. Uh, in terms of the other places, especially in Latin America, we look at two recent examples. Secretary Blinken was in Colombia at a joint press conference with new former guerrilla, now President Gustavo Petro. And Blinken said, it's on the State Department website, you can look it up, that you can't just look at law enforcement and enhancing law enforcement. You have to consider the root causes of violence. And he gave as corruption, impunity, and disequity. So if people are once somebody has more than somebody else, that one who has less, that's a cause of violence. If that's true, well, that's Marxist, and that's true. We can't exist together. And then you take Brazil, that we know about Lula. Uh, he had 8.
Steve, hold on a second, please. Justin, are you thinking we're getting all of this? The audio is coming through too? Because I can't hear him. Well, it comes and goes, so that's my problem. I can't hear him entirely. All right, Steve, do me a favor. Just back up one sentence.
Okay.
And pick up on Blinken and this disequity point.
Okay. So Secretary Blinken said that we can't just think about enhancing law enforcement. We have to look at the underlie the root causes of violence, which he called corruption, impunity, and disequity. So if one person has more than another, the one who has less is justified in violence, or at least if not justified, that's a cause of violence. That's an absurdity. That's Marxism.
That is Marxism. It is full on. And it sounds as though those talking points speech might have been written by Todd Robinson.
Absolutely.
In his role as the guy with international law enforcement in his portfolio, and of course, this Marxist agenda, unmistakably.
It's quite possible. And then in Brazil, we know Lula controlled 8 of the 11 Supreme Court justices, and one of those justices was the head of the Electoral Commission. And they outlawed during the campaign saying that Lula had been let out on a technicality. Lula wanted to say that he had been exonerated, which was untrue. And the Electoral Authority said, you cannot tell the truth. So there's no question that Lula was brought in fraudulently, and Ned Price, State Department spokesman, congratulated Brazil and said it is a model for democracy for the region.
Right.
So,
Well, there are lots of examples, I think, of the State Department agenda and its pursuit of them, even where they are at odds with the direction of the President of the United States. But the piece that I want to just make sure we nail down is, as a student of our government and its policies more generally, and you've been writing extensively on these subjects well beyond Guatemala for quite some time now, is the administrative state that you've given us a taste of in the context of the State Department more generally running its own government rather than the one that we've elected? And again, the Trump administration is probably the most egregious example, because you did see clear differences between the direction that the president was giving and that the permanent bureaucracy wanted, right?
yeah, I think that's for sure. And I mean, if you look at the best example in the United States is the Justice Department and the FBI, which is part of it. And of course, there the administration and the administrative state right now are in agreement with each other. But if you go back to the Trump years, they sure weren't. If you look at impeachment and think about Attorney General William Barr, that altered the sentencing guidelines. The Justice Department prosecutors asked for 9 years for Roger Stone, and those were way out of the guidelines. And Barr stepped in and he said no. It was his obligation actually to correct it. He said 3.5 to 4. That's what they. That's what the prosecution asked the judge to sentence Roger Stone to. And so 1,100 former prosecutors protested that. What's that about? I mean, there's evidence right there.
Hold the thought. We're going to come right back with more with Stephen Hecht, concluding this hour-long conversation by asking, what can we do about the administrative state? We'll get to that right now.